This week's Parshas Vayechi is the siyum, the conclusion of the book of Bereshis, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But by way of introduction, I'd like to point out that there's a theme which is repeated several times in the Parsha, the idea of death and burial. The Parsha begins with Yaakov's instructions that he wishes to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. He defends his decision to bury Rachel in Beis Lechem rather than bringing her to the Maras and Machpelah for burial. And what is the idea of a burial place in Jewish thought? The idea of a kever. Let me begin with the halacha. The Torah says in Parsha Shoftim that there are certain idolatrous practices that the Torah forbids. A person cannot practice nichush. Nichush is to make decisions on the basis of omens. For example, if a person is holding a stick and he drops the stick and he says, "Oh, that's a sign from heaven that I should do such and such, I shouldn't do such and such." So making a decision on the basis of an omen, that's called nichush. Then there's to be a ma'onein. A ma'onein is a person who makes decisions on the basis of times, like an astrologer. This date is auspicious for this type of activity, this date is not auspicious for that type of activity. That's forbidden. And there's a whole list. One of the things listed is called Doresh el Hamesim. Doresh el Hamesim, a person who inquires of the dead. If a person asks questions of the dead, that is a prohibited practice. The Torah says you can't be a Doresh el Hamesim. In the standard edition of the Rambam, there's a commentary called Hagos Maimoni that raises the following question. Imagine a person about to die, and you're interested in receiving some information from the next world. So you make the person swear that when his soul goes up there, it will come back and convey the information. So you are majbiyah. You make the soul swear that it will return and answer questions. So is that permitted or not permitted? Forget the question of whether it works or not. I don't know how you get it to work. But is it permitted? Yeah. So the Golos Maimoni says it's permitted. And the question is that why isn't this a prohibition of Doresh el Hamesim? You're not allowed to inquire of the dead. So why are you allowed to ask the soul to return and give answers? Now, the simple answer to the question, which is not the answer that he gives, is that at this time he's not dead yet. So you're not asking the dead, you're asking a living person to come back after he dies, so maybe technically that's not a violation. That would have been the simple answer. But the Golos Maimoni says an amazing thing, a fascinating thing. Because we know that a person is comprised of two parts. A person is comprised of a guf, of a body, and it's comprised of a neshama, a soul. Only the body dies. The soul doesn't die. Says this method of Doresh el Hamesim, inquiring of the dead, was a technique, it involved sorcery, that brought the body back, the body of the person who died back. So the person would die, and you would bring the body back and ask the body questions. That's what the Torah prohibits. That's Doresh el Hamesim, inquiring of the dead. But inquiring of the soul is not a prohibition, because the soul does not die. The soul is not called Mesim. The soul of a human being doesn't die. The soul of a human being lives eternally. So making an inquiry of the soul is permitted. So this is a fantastic thing. It's an amazing thing. That the prohibition of Doresh el Hamesim is some method of sorcery by which you bring the body of the deceased person back. That's prohibited. But to make inquiries of the soul, that's permitted. Therefore, you can make the soul swear that it will come back and convey information. He brings proofs to this, that there are stories that are recorded in the Talmud of people that asked questions of the dead, and the only seeming solution is that they were asking the souls, not the bodies. So, for example, the Talmud tells the story that the great sage Shmuel had a father who was called Avud Shmuel, the father of Shmuel, who had been given money as a deposit from orphans. And he did not leave instructions as to where the money could be found. So Shmuel was unable to return the money. So everyone said, Shmuel must have stolen the money for himself. It was an embarrassment. So the Talmud says that Shmuel went to the cemetery and he spoke to his father and asked him where the money is. And his father told him, this is where the money is, exactly this place. And he found the money and was able to return it. So how was he able to do that? So the Hagos Maimoni says, because Shmuel was not speaking to his father's body, he was speaking to his father's soul. Just as an aside, I'll mention that, and by the way, and this is, it seems, has become a common practice. That people do this from time to time. It's a little weird, but they do ask questions of the souls of the departed. But the question is this is a related question: can you ask souls to pray for you? Can you ask souls to pray for you? Now, this is a very intriguing question. The Rambam brings a medrash that a person is not allowed, a Jew is not allowed to ask an angel to intercede in his behalf. You cannot ask an angel to pray for you. Such a medrash. Now, there can be two reasons behind the medrash. The Rambam understands that the rationale of the medrash is because angels do not have free will. They cannot respond to a request. They follow their essential nature. And therefore, by making a request of the angel to intercede on your behalf, you are ascribing power to the angel which the angel doesn't have. And that's why it's tantamount to idolatry. Every act of idolatry is doing that. When a person worships a planet, a star, he is ascribing power to the planet or the star which it does not possess. And therefore, as well, when you make a request of an angel, you're doing the same thing. This is what the Rambam says. The Ramban seems to disagree. The Ramban seems to understand that angels do have free will, and angels can respond to requests. But the basis of the prohibition is that God wants us to serve Him directly. Because we should not relate to God through intermediaries. He wants us to have a direct relationship with Him. And that's why you can't ask an angel to intercede on your behalf. Now, it happens to be there are certain prayers that have become very, very well accepted in Klal Yisrael, which in fact are addressed to angels. The one which is not so common is in the Slichos. There's a prayer, there's actually a song that was composed to the prayer, where we say, Machnise Rachamim, that the angels who bring the prayers for mercy to God, Hachnisu Rachamim, bring our requests for mercy, Lifnei Bala Rachamim, before the all merciful God. So here you're addressing the angels that they should transport our prayers to God. So that was a very controversial part of the service. Many say that it shouldn't be said. But more problematic is the Shalom Aleichem that we sing every Friday night. One of the stanzas is Borcheini Lashalom, bless me in peace. And when you ask an angel to bless you, what is a blessing? A blessing really is a prayer to God, that God should bestow blessings. So you're asking the angel to intercede in your behalf. There were many poskim, many halachic decisors that were against the recitation of this verse. But in any case, that the Rambam rules that a person cannot ask an angel to intercede on your behalf, but to ask a human being to intercede on your behalf is certainly permitted. Now the Talmud says that if a person has someone sick in the house, you should go to a sage, to a Talmud Chacham, to a tzaddik, and have the person pray for you. So apparently you can't ask an angel, you can ask a human being. What about a soul? Can you ask a soul to pray on your behalf? It's a good question. So it's very interesting that the Mishnah Brura rules on this, because in Shulchan Aruch it is cited that there's a custom, Erev Rosh Hashanah, again I don't know if it's a widely observed custom, there's a custom Erev Rosh Hashanah to visit the cemetery. I mean, people do it before Rosh Hashanah, but the custom is specifically Erev Rosh Hashanah. And to pray at the gravesides. So the Mishnah Berurah says there that when you pray at a grave, you do not pray to the dead, you don't address the dead. You ask God that God should help us and answer our prayers in the merit of the righteous people who are buried here. But you don't pray to the dead. You don't ask the dead to intercede in your behalf, because in the same way you can't ask an angel to intercede in your behalf, you can't ask a dead person to intercede in your behalf. That's the Mishnah Berurah Paskins. However, there's a response from the Menachas Elazar, who brings many proofs not this way, that a person is allowed to ask a soul to intercede on your behalf, and it seems to me, just anecdotally, that this is the common practice. That the common practice at a funeral, for example, they always say that the soul of the person should go in front of the heavenly throne and pray for the family and for the survivors and for all of Klal Yisrael. Mashiach should come, and so on and so forth. Apparently this is the custom. So I guess we would have to say that according to the prevalent custom, the soul is considered not as an angel, but rather as another human being, and one could make a request and intercede.
Isn't that two different things? To make a statement about what the dead should do as opposed to speaking to the dead.
No, that's what I'm saying. But at a funeral, right, it seems that often the dead are addressed. Directly. Yeah. So it seems that's the prevalent practice. Yes.
Are we assuming that the soul is always by the body at a cemetery?
Well, this is the interesting thing, you see, and this is the point I wanted to make, that where is the soul? When a person dies, where is the soul? We tend to think that the soul goes up to heaven. But heaven is not a geographic location. Because heaven is a spiritual state, if you will. But it seems from the Torah that in some way there is a connection between the soul and the site where the body is buried. Because otherwise, what are you going to visit when you go to a grave? What's there? Especially after a time. The presumption is the body is long decayed. So what is at that place now? As apparently there is a connection between the burial place and the soul of the departed person. And that's the significance of visiting a grave.
There would be no merit to burying somebody in Israel otherwise.
I don't know about that. I think the value of burial in Israel relates to the body. You see, let me
in terms of
let me mention something which also has to do with the parsha. The parsha talks about a process of chanota, that vayachantu, the doctors, this is translated as embalmed Yaakov and embalmed Yosef. So we assume, what does this mean, this process of chanota? It's, we know that the Egyptians made mummies, where they preserved the bodies. So the presumption is that in the Egyptian style, Yaakov's body and Yosef's bodies were preserved. The Tosfos Yontif, one of the commentaries to the Mishnah, Maseches Olos, writes about the embalmment of Yaakov and Yosef, says, Ein zeh, this is not what they call in Egypt mumia, meaning a mummy. Now, they didn't make mummies out of Yaakov and Yosef. Here it's the exact opposite process. This process of chanota was a process by which the flesh was burnt off. It wasn't preserved. It was destroyed. Because you see constantly there's a reference to bringing the bones up to Eretz Yisrael, right? Yosef says, "Pakod yivkod elokim eschem," right? God will remember you. V'halisem es atzmosai mizeh etchem, and you will take my bones with you. What is the reference to bones? What about the rest of him? So the Mefarshim explain that this process of chanota was not a process of the preserving the flesh. It was a process of consuming the flesh. Because why would you want to do that? And the Gemara says a very surprising thing. The Gemara says that the kapara, the atonement of death, is not complete until the equal basar, until the flesh is consumed, is digested, so to speak, until it's absorbed in the earth. This is part of the process of kapara. Now, this is something which is very, very, very hard for us to understand. You see, we think of the body as being the tool of the soul, if you will. But it's more than that. There is an interaction between the body and the soul, and the body affects the soul, and the soul affects the body. So the person only has a kapara, only has an atonement when the imperfections of the body are rectified. And that involves its being reabsorbed into the earth. The holier the burial place, the greater the kapara. And therefore, if a person is buried in Eretz Yisrael, so the body is reabsorbed into the earth of Eretz Yisrael, that's considered something extra special. It seems it's not that it's a benefit for the soul as much as it's a benefit for the body. But in any case,
body is defined as flesh here, not bones.
Flesh.
Just the bones.
Flesh. Equal
Just
basar. The flesh.
Wait, it's better for the body, not better for the soul?
No, the benefit of burial in Eretz Yisrael, it seems, is for the body. It's that when the body decays, it should be absorbed into the soil of Eretz Yisrael. That's the benefit. Obviously, that's ultimately a benefit for the soul because of the interaction of the body and the soul. But it really is beneficial for the soul. But in any case, this is the point I want to make, that you see from this halachic discussion that there is something which is permanent about the soul. That when the Torah talks about a mace, Dorish al hamesim, that's a reference only to the body. Only the body dies. Right? The soul doesn't die. The soul lives on. The soul is eternal. The very term mace is inapplicable to the soul of a human being. And therefore, the idea of the grave, right, is the place where it's a shrine to the permanent element of the human being, which is the soul. The reason it's important for Klal Yisrael is because Klal Yisrael is a religion which is very much based on the idea of Masorah, the idea of tradition. It's not a religion or a culture which places supreme importance on the idea of progress. A technological society, right, is a progress-oriented society. New ways of living, and new devices, and new machinery, and new chemicals, and new drugs. Everything is new. New is good. Old is bad. And as soon as we can get rid of the old things, that's considered a positive thing. But Klal Yisrael is a religion which works the other way. There was a moment of clarity, of revelation at Har Sinai, and this is when we received the Torah, and we are drifting away from that moment of clarity. We are losing the sharpness, we are losing the perfect memory, the recollection of that event, and what we want to do is we want to go back to recall and reclaim our heritage. Therefore, we venerate shrines. We venerate the places where our forefathers were buried, where their souls are still accessible. And that's why a burial place is a very, very important thing. We return to the burial place. We honor the burial place. It's not just a question of disposal of the remains. It's a question that this is somehow a place where we can connect to the souls of the departed. Now, this idea of our connection to the past is brought out in an episode of this week's parsha in a very, very, very interesting way. There is a Jewish custom that Jewish boys are given a blessing, Yisimcha Elokim ki Ephraim v'chi Menasha, that God should make you like Ephraim and Menasha, the two sons of Yosef. Now, the Torah doesn't tell us what the equivalent bracha for girls would be. So, open any siddur, Friday night, it says that fathers should give their daughters the blessing, Yisimech Elokim, Kisara v'Rivka v'Rachel v'Leah. That God should make you like the matriarchs, Sarah and Rivka and Rachel and Leah. And that makes a lot of sense, because when you talk about who are the greatest women in the history of the Jewish people, you would say that the four matriarchs, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, these are the greatest women. So if you're giving your daughter a blessing, you should bless them. They should be like the matriarchs. But then the question arises that when it comes to the boys, if so, we should give the blessing, Yisumcha Elokim, Kavram, Yitzchak, V'Yakov, that God should make you like the patriarchs, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Those are the greatest men of Jewish history. Maybe you'll say God should make it like Moshe Rabbeinu. That might be a little over the top. But Moshe Rabbeinu probably was the greatest Jew that ever lived. Ephraim and Menasha undoubtedly were great people, but what is the idea of blessing children in that way specifically? God should make it Ephraim and Menasha. Now this is rooted in an episode in our parsha when Yosef brought his children Ephraim and Menasha to be blessed. So it says he blessed them, and it says B'cha Yivarach Yisrael, more, that this is how Jews will be blessed. They will say Yisimcha Elokim Ki Ephraim B'cha Menasha. So this is what Yaakov Avinu ordained, that this would be the formula with which Jewish parents would bless their sons. So what is unique about Ephraim and Menashe? So let me share with you a thought I heard many years ago. I heard from Rav Hutner Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, said like this. The Gemara says in Maseches Kedushin, Kol HaMelamed Ben Bino Torah. If you teach your grandson Torah, Mala Olav Akasav, this is considered in the verse, Ki'ilu Kiblu Mehar Sinai. It's as if he received it from Mount Sinai. It's as if he received the Torah from Har Sinai. Who's he? What is the antecedent of the pronoun he? So there are two possibilities. One is as if the grandfather received it from Har Sinai. The other possibility is as if the grandson received it from Har Sinai. The Maharsha, the commentator to the text, assumes the latter. That if a grandfather teaches his grandson Torah, it's as if the grandson received it from Har Sinai. Why should that be? What is so special teaching your grandson Torah? So Rav Hutner said like this, a very simple explanation. We know there's a process called Yeridas Hadoros. Yeridas Hadoros is the descent of the generations. Every generation is one step farther from, again, that moment of clarity at Har Sinai, and there's a decline, there's a loss of information, there's a loss of understanding. And we know that this has real consequences. We know that you can divide the history of the Torah into historical periods. We have the period of the Mishnah. The scholars of the Mishnah were called Tanoim. And we have the period of the Gemara. The scholars of the Gemara are called Amoraim. And the scholars of the post-Talmudic period are called Gaonim. And the post-Gaonic period are called Rishonim. And the post-Rishonim period are called Achronim. And there is a convention that authorities of one historical stage cannot disagree with authorities of an earlier stage. So the sages of the Gemara do not disagree with the Mishnah. They can discuss the Mishnah, they can strive to understand the Mishnah, but they can't dismiss the Mishnah. They can't say, no, we disagree. The Mishnah is sacrosanct. The Mishnah is established law, and it's our job only to understand it, to interpret it, to apply it, not to disagree with it. Once the Talmud was sealed, once the Gemara was sealed, again, the Gaonim didn't dispute the authority of the Gemara. They applied it. They tried to understand it. But it was established. It was given. We have the Rishonim, the medieval commentators, the early medieval commentators. So again, they never argued with the Talmud, never argued with the Gaonim. They only tried to interpret and explain. The period of the Rishonim ended with the writing of the Shulchan Aruch, about the year 1500. After that, it's considered a new era. And again, authorities post the Shulchan Aruch don't, or tend not to disagree. They only tend to try to explain the rulings of the earlier period. So what is the root of that? Because we understand that there is this process of decline, and every so often we reach a point where the drop is so precipitous that we understand we are no longer qualified to disagree with those who came before us. We can only try to understand what they said, but to have the audacity to disagree and dispute, that we don't have. This is the idea of Yeridas Hadoros. But even within a historical period, there is a process of Yerida. There is a process of descent. And sometimes, again, through historical events, this descent, this generation can be very, 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 very great. You know, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, passed away in, I believe it was 1984. The Gadol Hador of his time, the greatest of his generation, once said like this. He said that not long ago, before the Holocaust, if you were an expert in the entire Talmud and the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch, you were qualified to be the rabbi in a village. And now, if you have mastered the entire Talmud and the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch, you can be the greatest person of your generation. It was a decline. Now, the Holocaust was a historic event which totally transformed the level of scholarship. You know, what a person was before the Holocaust, to be considered a world-class scholar was much stiffer requirement than what it means to be a world-class scholar today. It's just a fact that I was once speaking to a rabbi who studied in the Telzer Yeshiva in the years before, between the 2 world wars. And he told me an amazing thing. He said that even then there was a decline. He said before the First World War, right, it was very common, he told me, that there were students who studied 16 hours a day. It was very common. He says, by my time, he said, between the 2 world wars, it was very rare to have a student that studied 16 hours a day. He says, 12 hours a day, everybody studied. He said, that was common. He says, but 16, he said, it was Yakar HaMetzius. That was something that was out of the ordinary. He says, but before the First World War, that was common. There was a process of descent. You know, even in my short lifetime, I see it. The difference between the great people that I saw in my younger years is, it's somewhat of an embarrassment for me to be the head of a yeshiva. But I think of the heads of my yeshiva when I was a teenager, and their immense stature, and now ostensibly, my teenage students are looking at me in the same way, but I can tell you it's a big difference. It's not what it was. It's not what it was. This is about the Yeridas Hadoros.
Maybe the difference remains the same.
Pardon?
Maybe the difference remains the same.
No, that may be, but I think not. But in any case, sometimes you can bridge the gap in a way. How can you bridge the gap? When you develop a connection to a person of an earlier generation. And this is something that if the opportunity ever presents itself, is worth doing. Someone that naturally you would not have had a connection with, but somehow you overcome the shyness and the reticence, and you decide to make an overture to a person who is much older and from a different time, and you learn with that person and speak to that person, you can, in a sense, skip a generation. We don't have too many of those anymore. Probably we're almost at the point that there are no more. Scholars who were students of the great yeshivas before the Holocaust. But if you can never find one of them, at this point they're undoubtedly quite old. But just to have the opportunity to speak to them and learn from them is a tremendous thing. Now we can preserve, through electronic media. We can tape and we can video. These people. It's certainly worthwhile. The time will come that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, that this will be the only way we have access to those people's memories. So if I said like this, imagine a person who would be, if things follow their natural course, would be 25 generations removed from Maimon Har Sinai. 25 generations removed from the revelation at Sinai. Because he learned Torah from his father, and his father learned from his father, and his father from his father, going back, and it's 25 generations. But if a person learns Torah from his grandfather, so he would have been 25 generations removed, but now he's only 24 generations removed. He's one generation closer, because instead of learning from his father, who learned from his father, this person learned directly from his grandfather. So he's one generation closer than he would have been. So you think, is that a big difference? One generation closer? Does that make a difference? Say Chazal, Kol HaMelamed Ben Beno Torah. If you teach your grandson Torah, it's considered in God's eyes as if the grandson received it from Har Sinai. Meaning, anything you do to come closer to the source is so precious, so valuable in God's eyes. It's as if you are standing at Mount Sinai yourself, as if you got it literally from the source. Because you bridge the gap, you make yourself a little bit closer to the original source. And we can do this in many ways. One way, of course, is to try to identify and find these people, these rare people who are older, an older generation, and try to hear from them and learn from them, be inspired by them. But also in terms of the things that we study. Right? Many of us are tempted to study, modern, pre-digested Torah texts. But if we really are ambitious and we go back to the source, so we can learn directly from Rashi. We don't have to learn from somebody who 5 years ago wrote a book about Rashi, which means we are that much farther removed from the source. If we learn Rashi's commentary, we are able to go back 900 years.
Rashi's hard to understand without elucidation.
You work at it, right? And then you learn directly from Rashi, right? So you're skipping many generations in the process. Two of the people in Jewish history that achieved this were, of course, Ephraim and Menasha. Ephraim and Menasha were students of their grandfather, to the extent that their grandfather Yaakov said, Ephraim and Menasha, Keruven b'Shimon Yuli. The Ephraim and Menasha will be like Reuven and Shimon. They actually became Shvatim, they became tribes, and the process by which they became tribes is that they were promoted from the level of grandchildren to the level of children. Because what should have been is that one of the tribes would have been Yosef, and Yosef in turn had two children, Ephraim and Menashe. This would have been a division, but instead Yosef was given the double portion. But he was given the double portion by promoting his grandchildren to the level of children. Ephraim and Menashe, Reuven v'Shimon Yuli. He said Ephraim and Menashe should be like Reuven and Shimon.
Do we think that they both learned that they're going to? I said Menashe.
They both. We'll talk about it in a minute. Right? But they both were Talmidim. They were both brought close to the level of being Yaakov's children. So this is a bracha that we give to our children, that you should always be brought closer to the source. Right? Just like Ephraim and Menashe were. This is something which is unique about Ephraim and Menashe. This is one interpretation. So this relates to everything we said, that Judaism is a religion where we all aspire and yearn to be closer to the original source. Not that we should be removed, and not there should be a generations of intermediates, but rather we should strive to be as close to the original ideas as we can. But let me share with you another idea about this blessing of Ephraim and Menashe. Fantastic thing. There were two great Gedolei Yisrael. They were contemporaries. One was the Chafetz Chaim. Everyone heard of the Chafetz Chaim, the author of the Mishnah Berurah. And at the same time, there was a guy, Reb Chaim Brisker, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, who was a tremendous guy. Now, one of the amazing historical ironies is this: when you think of the Chafetz Chaim, like, what is the first thing that comes to mind? You know, like the immediate mental association. You think of his tremendous piety. Like, this is the person whose life was devoted to Shmiras HaLashon, to guarding every word he said, to bringing the many to merit, Kiru B'chaikim, reaching out to the people that were far from Jewish practice and life, people don't realize was really a very important theme in the Chafetz Chaim's life. As we think of him as a great tzaddik, but the reality is that in addition to being a great tzaddik, he was a tremendous Talmud Chacham. In his time, it was like world class. Breathtaking scholarship. And of course, he was the author of the Mishnah Berurah, which is the decisive halachic source for the last almost 100 years. But what's interesting is that we tend to overlook that, even though the Mishnah Berurah is right in front of us. But if you study the Mishnah Berurah, if you study a Talmudic tractate, for example, that relates to subjects in the Mishnah Berurah, and you look at the Mishnah Berurah, you see that the Chafetz Chaim's wealth of knowledge and his depth of understanding was just breathtaking. And just today, I was reading a piece of Mishnah Berurah, and I was dazzled by the fact that the Chafetz Chaim had on his fingertips, Torah sources, knowledge that really had no direct bearing on the subject at hand, but he was able to pull it out of this treasury of Torah knowledge, and apply it in a just a magnificently brilliant way. But it's overlooked by the fact that he was such a tzaddik. People don't think of him as an outstanding scholar, even though we all know that it's true. Reb Chaim Brisker was the exact opposite. Reb Chaim Brisker, in yeshiva circles, Reb Chaim Brisker is the quintessence of a Torah scholar. I mean, his intellect, his powers of analysis, his just, would be considered once in a millennium. There's a scholar of such insight and depth and profundity and comprehensive knowledge. But what people don't realize was that Reb Chaim Brisker was a tzaddik that is, you can't imagine. People used to abandon babies on his doorstep, and he would raise them until they were of marriageable age, and he would marry them off and support them. And this was something which happened all the time. And it's known that his house was like a public thoroughfare. In other words, in his house, it's like none of the children had a bed, guaranteed, right? Because there always could be people that were, homeless, that were staying, and they would be welcome, and people used to write advertisements on the walls of his house. People would come in, with announcements. It was just, he was open to everyone. And people forget that because his intellect, his Torah scholarship was so amazing. But having said that, you have to wonder that maybe the fact that both of them had both qualities meant that neither quality was developed to the extent it could have been. In other words, the Chafetz Chaim scholarship did not develop to the extent it could have because so much of his attention and energy was devoted to acts of piety. And likewise, the Chaim Brisker's piety perhaps was not as developed as it could have been because so much of his activity was devoted to his masterful scholarship. Sfarim tell us that Ephraim and Menashe, though they were brothers, were very, very different. Very different. And that's also related to an episode in this parasha. Because we know that Menashe was the firstborn. And Yosef brought him for a blessing, so he put Menashe on the right side of Yaakov and Ephraim on the left side of Yaakov, so that Menashe would receive the blessing of the right hand, because he was the firstborn. And Yaakov crossed his hands to place his right hand on Ephraim's head and his left hand on Menashe's head, and Yosef was very upset. And he says, Father, this is the firstborn. And Yaakov says, Yodati b'ni yodati. I know, I'm not senile. I know exactly what I'm doing. He says, both of them will be very great, but Ephraim is going to be greater. It's going to be greater. And Rashi explains, greater in Torah scholarship. The Sfarim tell us like this, that Ephraim was the greater in Torah scholarship, and Menashe was the greater in worldliness. In terms of leadership, in terms of military prowess, and so on and so forth, Menashe was the greater. In terms of Torah scholarship, Ephraim was the greater. Therefore, Yaakov Avinu felt it was appropriate to put the right hand on Ephraim, because after all, we value that more. The Netziv points out a fascinating thing, that throughout the Chumash, whenever the Shvatim are listed for counting, the census, etc., Ephraim is always before Menashe, except in Parshas Pinchas, the very last counting of the Jewish people. There Menashe is before Ephraim. So the question, why is that? So the Netziv says a very, very reasonable thing. He says, because the last census was the census in anticipation of the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. It was a military census. So therefore, for the purpose of conquest, Menashe had precedence over Ephraim, because Menashe, in halichos olam, as he puts it, in ways of the world, worldliness, Menashe was the superior Ephraim. So as long as the Jews were in the Midbar, so there the counting of the Jews was, in a sense, as the Zohar puts it, it was to ascertain the numbers of God's armies. So in God's army, the Shevet Ephraim had precedence over Shevet Menashe, but in the army for the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, there Menashe had precedence over Ephraim. So Reb Tzadok HaKohen says like this. Reb Tzadok HaKohen says that undoubtedly Yosef must have had both elements in his own personality. In other words, if he had two such children, like where did these talents come from? Obviously it came from the father. Yosef must have had these two. But in Yosef, neither could fully develop. Because his Torah scholarship was eclipsed by his worldliness, and his worldliness was eclipsed by his Torah scholarship. So therefore, in Yosef, neither could develop to its fullest potential. But Yosef had two sons, and therefore what was incompletely developed in Yosef became completely developed in Ephraim and completely developed in Menashe. Meaning the half of Yosef, which was Torah scholarship, became fully developed in Ephraim, because Ephraim's focus was that to the exclusion of worldly matter. And in Menashe, the worldliness was fully developed, because to a certain extent it was not eclipsed by undoubtedly he learned Torah, but it wasn't the major focus of his life, and therefore what was incompletely developed in Yosef was completely developed in the children of Ephraim and Menashe. This is what Tzadok HaKohen writes. And it's very interesting that if you look at the text of the Chumash, when Yaakov Avinu told said that the blessing that Jews would confer on their children is Yisimcha Elokim K'Ephraim V'Menashe, it says like this. He said, B'cha Yivarach Yisrael. In you, singular, or through you, Jews will bless their children, saying, Yisimcha Elokim K'Ephraim V'Menashe. Now this is a very odd use of the singular, because he's speaking to Ephraim and Menashe, we think. So he should have said, Bochem, through you, plural, Yivarach Yisrael. What does it mean? B'cha. The singular undoubtedly is to Yosef. In other words, the real bracha is you should be like Yosef. But how do you bless a person to be like Yosef? Right? Yosef really is the incomplete manifestation of the two aspects of the personality. So we bless our children is you should be like Ephraim and Menasha, where these two aspects of the personality were fully developed. And that really is the greatest bracha that can be given to a person, that you should fully actualize your potential. And that was unique about Ephraim and Menasha, even more so than Yosef. That Ephraim and Menasha each was able to actualize to the fullest extent the aspect of Yosef which he inherited.
Does that mean he skips a generation in the case of Menasha with his learning?
Pardon?
We earlier said that what was unique about them was they skipped a generation.
Yeah, but nevertheless, the emphasis of Menashe was the one, the emphasis of Ephraim was the other. That's what Tzadok says. Now, before we finish, I just want to mention that, again, as we said in the beginning, that Parshas Vayechi is the conclusion of the Sefer Bereshis. And I just want to mention one thing about this, that Ramban, he said many, many times, what is the idea of the division of the Chumash into 5 books? I don't think we should assume it's simply for convenience sake, because putting it all in one volume would make it very heavy. There are 5 books because each book has a theme. And when the theme is concluded, the book is concluded. So Sefer Bereshis ends where it ends because the theme of Sefer Bereshis ends at this point, and Sefer Shemos ends where it ends because the theme of Sefer Shemos ends at that point. Yes.
Who created these divisions?
It's part of when the text of the Torah was given to Moshe Rabbeinu.
It's not the Greeks.
It was given. No, it was given these divisions. The chapters, the numbers of the chapters, that was the introduction of non-Jewish scholars, the numbering system. But the books, the division of the Sfarim, that's from the Torah itself. So the question is, what is the Sefer Bereshis and what is the Sefer Shemos? The Ramban says an amazing thing. The Ramban says that Sefer Bereshis is called the Sefer Yetzirah. Chazal call it the book of creation. And Sefer Shemos is called Sefer Geula, the book of redemption. Now, what does it mean, Sefer Yetzirah? Sefer Yetzirah means simply the book of the creation of the world. Well, it would seem that topic is covered in the first 2 chapters of Bereshis. Like, why would you call the entire book, which has 50 chapters, why would you call it Sefer Yetzirah? So the Ramban writes, because it isn't just the Yetzirah of the world, it's also the book of creation, of formation of the Jewish people. That the formation of the Jewish people is completed with the completion of Sefer Bereshis. What does that mean? Ramban has a theme which runs through the entire book of Bereshis, which is the idea of Maisa Avos Siman Lebanim. That which occurs to the forefathers foreshadows and foretells that which will happen to the children. All the episodes, all the events in the lives of the patriarchs are really laying the groundwork for the events that will unfold on the national level to the nation as a whole. And if you go through the Ramban's commentary to Sefer Bereshis, you find that every juncture he points out that this alludes to a later event, and this alludes to a later event, and this alludes to a later event. And just give one illustration. You know the story of Avraham Avinu when he went down to Egypt because of the famine. And his wife Sarah was taken, and God brought plagues on Paro, and Sarah was released, and Avraham left Mitzrayim with great wealth. Says the Ramban, this foretells the Egyptian enslavement and the liberation of the Jewish people as a nation, which is described in Sefer Shemos. But this is how God, in a sense, lays the groundwork for the future course of history. He brings the Avos through certain patterns in time, which are replicated on the larger scale, national level, in the later history of the Jewish people. Now, the Ramban says that what was unique about the office was that their tents were considered dwelling places for the Shekhinah. The divine presence rested on their tents. It was beside Shekhinah alei ohalehem. It was the mystery of the divine presence on their tents. That's the madrega. That was the level of the office. Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were not just human beings. There were people who lived on a higher plane, the plane of holiness, where the presence of the Shekhinah was manifest in their tents. With their deaths, there was a rapid decline, and the Jewish people during the Egyptian enslavement were very, very much not that way. They, according to the Talmud, there was a tremendous spiritual decline in Egypt. The Jews stopped practicing circumcision. They began to practice idolatry. Certainly the Shekhinah was not present in their lives. But the book of Shemos is the book of redemption. Now again, we have the same question. That in what sense is the book of redemption? Redemption is only dealt with in the first 4 weekly portions, Bereshis, Shemos, Vayera, Bo, B'Shalach. After that, the Jews are redeemed, the Red Sea is split, the Jews are freed. Why is the entire book the book of redemption? So the Ramban says, because redemption doesn't mean simply political liberation. The process of redemption is only complete when the Jews are restored to the original level of the office, that the Shekhinah has come to rest upon their tents. And for that to happen, we have to have the conclusion of Sefer Shemos. We have to have the giving of the Torah. We have to have the building of the Mishkan. And in fact, where does the book of Shemos end? The book of Shemos ends with the construction of the Mishkan and the Shekhinah coming to rest on the Mishkan. That is discussed in the very last verses of Sefer Shemos. That is when the process of restoration is complete. The Jews have been restored to the level of the Avos, and that is the conclusion of the book of Geula. So in a sense, what the book of Shemos is a reclamation of the level of the Avos who concluded their careers in the book of Bereshis. And in a sense, this is important for us to know, that as Jews, what we are trying to do in life is not something new. We are just trying to reclaim, to earn back the madrega, the spiritual level of those that came before us. That's all we're trying to do. And that makes it easier. Right? That makes it easier. Because we're not coming to invent something new. We're not trying to make something innovative and original. We are trying simply to trace the steps of our forefathers and reclaim the madregas that they achieved. And to a great extent, they made this possible by integrating into their personalities, into their souls, certain personality traits, certain character traits, which we in turn inherit from them, which makes it easier for us to reclaim and regain that which is their heritage. And that really is the turning point of Parshas Vayechi, the Sefer Shemos. Because Vayechi ends with the passing of the Avos, the passing of Yosef, these great tzaddikim. Shemos begins with the very, very terrible decline, but it is a upward process through the book and ends in the same high point where Bereshis ends. I mentioned in the past that there is a Jewish custom that the weeks after Parshas Vayechi, the weeks we read the Parshias of Shemos, Vayera, Bo, B'Shalach, Yisro, Mishpatim, according to some Truma Tzav as well, is called the weeks of Shovavim. Shovavim is an acronym for Shemos, Vayera, Bo, B'Shalach, Yisro, Mishpatim. And these are considered weeks that are very auspicious for tshuva, very auspicious for repentance. I had a friend who studied in the Slonimer Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, and they had a practice during these weeks of Shovim that everybody had to make a commitment to Torah study with greater intensity. So some people made a commitment that they would not speak during the learning sessions. So if the learning session was 4 hours, that they would not interrupt speaking mundane things. And for the 4 hours of the learning session, they would only say the words of Torah. And some people would make that commitment for 2 learning sessions. And there were other people that made a commitment to learn an extra learning session for 5 extra hours from 2 in the morning to 7 in the morning. You had to have a doctor's note to do that, to join that program, but people made that commitment. And the idea was because these weeks were auspicious. Why are these weeks auspicious for repentance? Because that is what tshuva really is. Tshuva is translated as return. What does it mean to return? How do you return to a place you've never been? The idea is that tshuva is going back to the madrega of the Avos. It's trying to reclaim that which they bequeathed to us. So it's always going back. These are the weeks that are coming up, the weeks after this Shabbos, the weeks of Shovim, the weeks of Sefer Shemos, are weeks that are very, very auspicious for reclamation of the madregas of the Avos. Now, so they're considered times that are auspicious for tshuva. Now, simply, it's the middle of the winter. It's halfway between Sukkot and Pesach. Now, so we need to recharge our batteries at that time, because it's those are the high points of the year, and we're reaching the point where we always need reinforcement. So this is as good a time as any. So hopefully, B'ezras Hashem, these weeks following the Shabbos, weeks of Shovim, we should all use to strengthen ourselves and hopefully to regain and perhaps reclaim, that which the legacy, the great legacy of the Avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, the Imos, Sarah, Rachel, Valeah, and hopefully that as we go through the book of Shemos, we'll ultimately come to that point where the Shekhinah will come to rest in our tents as well.